right, so thanks for being here. I'm Dimitri, and as I was telling Masha and Stefan earlier, I was one of the first hires in SciOI in 2019, if I recall correctly, early 2019, with two other postdocs. So it's nice to be back. I left in 2022 for the position in which I still am in northern Sweden. So it's good to be back and see SciOI once again. So today I'm going to talk about some stuff I've been working on. So I'm a philosopher of AI and cognitive science, or more specifically a philosopher of science, specialized in cognitive science and AI. And what I'm going to talk about today is issues around how can we try and explain the sorts of complex AI systems, especially deep large language, deep artificial neural networks, and especially large language models today by using some strategies that come from cognitive science, especially work on so-called cognitive ontologies in cognitive science. I'm going to try to argue that we should do something similar when it comes to AI systems such as large language models. So this is the plan for today. I'm just very quickly going to, draw a few distinctions about, AI and its relations to cognitive science and philosophy. So which sorts of contributions can these fields make to each other, and how has this changed? Then I'm going to provide an overview of some of the methods that are used today for trying to understand large language models especially. Then I'm going to go and do this jump into cognitive science and show, well, here's a method that has proven to be quite useful, quite effective in cognitive science for trying to explain complex systems like brains and human and non-human. And then I'm going to analyze one case study coming from Eli Pavlik's lab in mechanistic interpretability of large language models, and show how it can give us some idea of how functional ontologies can be explanatorily helpful in explaining AI systems. So one thing to say here is that I'm going to be focusing on large language models, but that's just because they are the kinds of systems that are among the most investigated today. And but the points I make here are supposed to be general to deep neural networks as a whole, or at least the complex ones that we have today, not specifically large language models, but large language models I think give us a good case study. All right, so AI has traditionally been seen as both a research tool and a research target, even though until recently it was mostly seen as a research tool, at least within philosophy and cognitive science. So the fields of AI, philosophy and cognitive science, as you know, have decades of interaction, mutual interest. So philosophers, AI researchers, and cognitive scientists had been talking to each other and working together from pretty much the beginning of the field in the 50s. And when it comes more specifically to the relationships between philosophy and cognitive science, we had questions that had to do with, for example, what's the right architecture for cognition? So what are the components and structure of cognitive systems or of systems such that they can be cognitive or that they become cognitive? Or what is learned and what is innate in cognitive systems? Another question that has seen philosophers and cognitive scientists debate quite a lot. And the answers here depend also on the paradigms that have shaped the history of AI since its beginning. Right? So the answers here for what is the architecture of cognition, what is learned and what is innate, are closely related to what sort of view one has when it comes to how you go about and build an AI system. So do you think AI systems or artificial intelligence systems should be built by means of a symbolic architecture, by means of a connectionist or neural network architecture, or something different, such as, you know, robotic or embodied AI approaches, right? So the relationships there were and are quite clear, and this is so to this day. So there is ongoing debate about, you know, whether current deep neural networks give us a good grasp or good models for some features of biological cognition that would suggest that, for example, the symbolic approach to language, for example, might be false. And then you have the more, you know, freewheeling philosophical questions, such as can artificial systems really be intelligent? What does that mean? And what would be required for that to be the case? And then even more speculatively, can artificial systems be conscious? If so, what would they need to have in order to be so? So some philosophers are interested in these questions, especially, you know, the consciousness one. I'm not at all. I'm interested in this one mostly, and on these ones. Now, when it comes to philosophy of science, then we can ask things like, well, what is the nature of these AI models, right? What roles can they play in science? So should we treat, say, convolutional neural networks as models of visual processing in you know, humans and other related animals? Or should we see them as something different, as predictive models, but not explanatory models, because maybe they do not, you know, mirror the specific goings on in the system, but they give us good predictive tools? So can they be explanatory models, or do they play another role? Or maybe they are neither, right? Maybe they're just completely doing things that are completely different than what happens in visual processing, say, or in language processing, in the case of large language models, such that they give us another sort of story about how a different system might be able to implement such capacities, even though they are very different from how they're implemented in humans and other animals. So are AI models models of cognitive capacities? Are they models of brain function? Can they be used as such? So these are all questions that are, you know, much discussed in philosophy of science in relation to cognitive science and the contributions that the AI can make to both fields. But recently, especially with the third wave of connectionism, there has been an increase in interest in AI systems, not anymore as tools to find something out about something else, like biological cognition, but rather as research targets themselves, to try to understand how they work, not how we can use them to try to figure out how biological cognition works, but, well, how actually do they work, the AI systems themselves. And this has come, or became, you know, more and more important during this third wave of connectionism, so the deep learning revolution since 2012, approximately, that we've been living through. And, you know, with all this progress in artificial systems that are able to do very well things like visual processing, language translation, and then the whole generative AI thing, so language generation, image generation, and so on. And then the questions became, well, how do convolutional neural networks work, for example, or image generation models, or large language models? And how can we compare their capabilities with biological capabilities? So when a large language model, say, outputs something that looks like, you know, a statement in a language, say in English, saying, you know, Berlin is the capital of Germany, is this an assertion? So is this the kind of system that can assert something? Does it know that Berlin is the capital of Germany? Or is something different going on there? So these are the sorts of questions that we are interested in, or I am interested in, lately, and many other philosophers of science specializing in AI are also interested in. So, and there you can think about, you know, all the similarities and differences between the systems and human and biological systems, such as how they learn, the available data, what algorithms they use, the patterns of success and error that they display. And even here, you know, comparisons are sort of fraught. They're not so simple. So you may think, well, if you think about large language models, right, they are trained on this mass of data, gigantic data. And then, well, humans don't do that. Well, it's not as much, but humans also get lots of data, right? So if you consider every millisecond of stimulus that you get from the world, right? And you count each one of those as one data point, right? Then you get a lot of data as well as you grow up. So the comparisons here are tricky, right? They may seem intuitive. No, we don't get all that data as humans when we're learning. Well, but then try to make a fair comparison, right, with a data point. What would be the closest to a data point in the case of humans, right? And then you get all this complex data that you're getting all the time, right, from different modalities. So this is tricky as well. But my focus for this talk is going to be on large language models and how we can try and make some progress in understanding how they work. So there are two main approaches nowadays for trying to understand large language models, and actually these apply also to convolutional neural networks and other popular deep learning systems. So one is benchmarking, the most popular, also throughout the history of AI. Well, you may even think that the original Turing test was deep down a benchmark. So we have a proliferation of those, and they are used for mainly two purposes, but not only, but mainly. So one is a more practical aim. So we want to figure out, well, what is the system good for, right? What can I use it reliably for, say, if I'm interested in a specific practical application. But we can also use it for a more theoretical aim, and also people do that. So using benchmarks to try and understand the capabilities of these AI systems, right? So what are they able to do? What kinds of capacities do they have? Over and beyond their reliability, right? So you may have a system that is unreliable, but that shows under certain conditions at least, say a very interesting capacity that in humans counts as cognitive or intelligent. And you can use benchmarks to try and probe those capabilities. But there are some limitations with them, right? So you don't have much insight under the hood at all, because benchmarks are only looking at behavior, right? So you give it a task, and then you get hopefully a carefully designed task, and then you get an output, and then you try to understand, well, in light of the task, what does this output tell me about what the system is able to do, right? What its capabilities are. You don't actually look inside the network. You can only infer at most from its behavior what may be going on inside. And there is a worry about what benchmarks really probe. At least many benchmarks, they come from human testing. So things that you give to humans, like, I don't know, the US bar exam, like, their attorney exam or whatever that is. And then you see how the AI systems fare when it comes to those tasks. But then there is a question, of course, on whether those tasks are the sorts of tasks that AI systems are, supposed to answer, right? So because they may not be probing what we're interested in, right? So while, say, a medical examination for humans is going to probe knowledge and memorization, in LLMs, for example, it may only probe for, was this in the data set or not, right? Or was something similar to this in the training data set or not? So some benchmarks may not be appropriate measures of capabilities in AI systems, especially the ones that have been designed for humans and then are just, slightly modified, and then to try and get some results from systems like LLMs. And part of the one of the consequences of this is that it's difficult to generalize to similar tasks. So maybe you have a benchmark that is supposed to test, say, medical knowledge, and you have another one that is supposed to test, medical reasoning within a specific field of knowledge. And it's unclear whether you can generalize from one to the other, right? The system may be good at memorization, but not at reasoning, for example, about the knowledge it has. So it may be difficult to do the same sorts of generalizations we do when so if I talk to you and you prove to be a knowledgeable doctor, then I'm going to also assume that you can diagnose, and think about symptoms and their consequences in the context of your medical knowledge, right? While I cannot assume the same when it comes to these systems. Or at least it's not clear that I can. Now, another method that has been gaining popularity lately is mechanistic interpretability. And here, the idea is to focus on the computational nuts and bolts of what's going on in deep neural networks. So we may ask questions like, what do specific nodes or attention heads do given certain inputs in a certain context? How may large language models do things like variable binding? How may they do syntactic and semantic composition? And there, what I'm interested in is exactly looking at the specific computational algorithms and the specific nodes, what they are doing in this case. So is there a node that tells you, well, this is a plural noun, for example, and sends this information to another node saying, well, since this is a plural noun, the verb should be plural. Things like that, right? So you try to find these sorts of relationships between internal components of the systems. And there you can try, by knowing that, so by knowing the mechanistic workings of the systems, you can try and explain both how they succeed in certain things and how they may fail in other things. But there are some limitations, right? So given the difficulty of doing the kinds of experimentation that are required to find out these computational mechanisms, these techniques are mostly applied to small models, to small LLMs. It's very difficult to apply them to big systems, such as the ones that most people use nowadays. So we're typically talking about systems like GPT-2, sometimes GPT-3, small, things like that. Just because it's so computationally intensive and you require so much data to do this sort of research that you can't do it with very big systems. And this leads to a problem as well, right? So how do you generalize? So just because you saw something or an algorithm, you found an algorithm for a certain sort of task in a 2 million parameter LLM, can you generalize from that to the claim, well then, ChatGPT with its trillion parameters is also doing something similar? It's unclear that you can, because the constraints on a smaller network may be quite different from the constraints on a big one. Not to mention that the big ones nowadays, they have lots of post-training procedures that these small ones didn't have. So basically, benchmarks investigate behavioral performance, while mechanistic interpretability investigates the computational building blocks. But the question is also, well, how can we connect performance with mechanism, right? So how do we bridge the algorithms that we may find in the toy models with the performance that we see in the benchmarks? And how, if there is a way, can we both, look under the hood, try to figure out how these computational systems work, but preserve at least some degree of generalization, such that if I find something on GPT-2 small, then I can at least have a good, or make an inference that is a justified inference that GPT-3 is also doing something similar, say, when solving that specific task. And here is where I suggest that we take the cue from cognitive science, and specifically from work on what came to be called as cognitive ontologies. So what are these? So the basic idea is that when you provide explanations in cognitive and comparative psychology, what you have is a sort of cycle, or rather, a collection of categories that stand in close relationship to each other. So we have tasks that help probe functions, cognitive functions, right? And then for those cognitive functions, you try and look for the neural implementation or computational implementation if you're doing computational neuroscience. And their relationships are complex, right? Because the neural implementation constrains what sorts of cognitive functions the system can have. And of course, the cognitive functions the system has constrains the tasks it can solve and how successfully it can solve them. So the question that cognitive ontology asks is, what are the right categories for each of those? So what are the cognitive functions? What are the neural implementation units and so on and so forth, such that we can draw these relationships? Cognitive function X is implemented by these and these neural systems and explain performance in these and these tasks. What are the categories there? So it started as a functional structuring mapping, trying to map neatly one function from classical psychology to a specific structure in the brain, a network or a brain area. But then it moved, mostly because philosophers got involved, into broader questions about what are the right ontologies. So what are the right units for explaining cognition? Right? What are the functions that really are out there in cognitive systems? What are the units of computational mechanistic implementation? Right? What is the neural code? How does this relate to the functions that cognitive systems have? So the questions we ask in cognitive ontology debates is, what cognitive functions are there? What kinds of cognitive tasks are there? How does a cognitive task relate to specific cognitive functions? And what are the right structural categories for brain implementation? And of course, how do they relate to each other? So a quick example, so take the working memory model by Baddeley and Hitch. So it's a model in cognitive science about how working memory works, right? So what it is composed of. So according to this theory, I'm not going to go much into this, but it's just to illustrate. So we have this sort of functional structure of working memory. So working memory can be broken down into a central executive that defines attentional, so what is going to be attended to. Then a system that gets and stores short-term visual information, a system that gets and stores short-term audio information, and an episodic buffer that brings them together and also integrates other sensory modality information that is being received in that specific moment. And there were several tests done on people to try and figure out how these relate to each other and whether we can block one and see only the others at play, and you can do that. There was lots of work on the working memory capacity, such as, so this is a benchmark as a task, memory span tests. So subjects are presented with lists of numbers or letters or words, and they are asked to memorize them and repeat them. And the test stops when the person makes a mistake, basically. And through these methods, it was found out that working memory has a limit of between 5 and 7 elements, but it's made a bit more complicated because you can also chunk things, and then it's actually 5 to 7 chunks of things, and this chunking is supposed to be done at least partially by the episodic buffer, or assisted by it. But that's just to give you an example, right, of one case in which we have a cognitive function, working memory, then we try to explain it in functional terms. And then, after you have this, you also look for, well, where are they realized in the brain? So where is the central executive, right? Is it in the certain areas of the prefrontal cortex? Where is the phonological loop and stuff like that, right? So we can also use a brain imaging to try and figure out what is going on there. So to put it in our hierarchy, or in our sort of cycle of ontologies, so we have ontologies for cognitive tasks, right? So things like memory span tests or digit span tests that are a kind of memory span test. You have a cognitive function that we've individuated as something that cognitive systems really have. So they really have a capacity called working memory. and that is characterized by some functional properties, and those functional properties are then explained by this functional implementation here, right? By the this functional breakdown. Here we are not talking about specific areas, right, of the brain. We're not even talking about specific computations. We are doing a sort of boxology explanation, right, of what's going on here. So purely functional explanation. And then we can look at where these functional components that we posit are realized and how they are realized in the brain, by trying to find the neural populations that are doing or contributing to each of these functions. So can we do something similar for AI systems? Because it would be quite nice, right? Because now we have, now we have benchmark tests, which are sorts of like cognitive tasks, insofar as they only look at behavior. On the other side, we have mechanistic implementation, which is closest to neural implementation, but I'm going to argue it also gives us quite some material to work with when we want to try and build or try to figure out what the functional implementation is of certain capacities. So, however, I mean, it's debatable whether we should apply cognition at all for systems like LLMs and other artificial neural networks, so I'm going to avoid that just because I don't want to buy into the idea that they are cognitive systems. Complicated question. So I'm just going to talk about functional ontologies, use a more neutral term. So the idea here is that, this sort of thing may work as the bridging between, benchmarks and mechanistic implementation. So between the methods that are most used nowadays to try and understand deep neural networks, and with my focus here, especially LLMs. So let's see how this could work. So the questions then are similar to the questions we would ask of a cognitive system, right? But then we ask things like, well, what functions are there? So what functions do LLMs, or does a certain kind of LLM possess internally? What kinds of tasks can we put to it? How should we characterize them or categorize them? So what is the same task as another one? What is a different task, right? So for example, a digit span task, maybe different kinds of digit span tasks, maybe the same kind of task for all interesting scientific purposes, while say perhaps a digit span task and a letter span task may be different, may need to be categorized differently. And then the same sorts of questions, right? How does a specific task relate to a specific function? So how can performance in that task reveal anything about a certain specific function? What are the right functional categories for implementation? So how can we break down a generic function into more specific functional boxes? And how do they relate to those functions? One hypothesis here, which I think is likely, but is that all these questions are going to have different answers for different kinds of AI systems, even maybe of the same kind. Say an LLM that only underwent pre-training versus an LLM that also underwent quite some post-training. The functions and categories might be different, at least slightly different. But this is likely, but I'm not sure. But let's look at a case study just to try and illustrate this. So let's focus, as I mentioned, on LLMs, transformer architecture. And I'm going to be relying here on work by Merullo et al. From Eli Pavlik's lab, as I mentioned earlier. And they did some mechanistic interpretability work on GPT-2 medium, so a small, relatively small system with around 500 million, yes, parameters. And they tested two sorts of tasks: indirect object identification and object color matching, trying to figure out the algorithms that were being implemented by the systems when they were solving these tasks. what are these tasks? So in the indirect object identification task, the task is something like this. You get this input, you are the LLM, you get this input. Then Matthew and Robert had a lot of fun at school. Robert gave a ring to, and you have to complete the sentence. In this case, the desired answer is Matthew, right? So the idea is that Robert gave a ring to Matthew because they had, you know, this story of friendship. And in the object color matching task, you have a question such as, on the table, there is a blue pencil, a black necklace, and a yellow lighter. What color is the pencil? Answer, and the LLM has to complete with the correct answer. So for what regards the first task, GPT-2 Medium got 100% performance. When it came to the second task, it got almost 50%. But we are going to come back to this performance issue later. So Merulo and al., they wanted to look at how the system actually does it, and they used a technique called path patching, which is a kind of causal intervention on the system, such that you change the values. So you record values for a certain input, then you present the network with a different input, and then you replace some of the values of the second one with values that recorded for the first one. So you change the values of some of the nodes according to your hypotheses about what the nodes are doing. Such that, for example, you may get a system that, you know, so for example, let's suppose we have an input like this one is white, right? In this case, you have a single noun and a single verb. But then use this method to change the activations of certain nodes such that they indicate plural noun. And so if you only change those and leave all the rest the same, then you're going to get an output from the LLM that is going to be something like this one are white. Because you change the plural noun indicator without changing anything else in the network. Very, very roughly. So it's more complicated than this, but just to give you an idea of the method they used. And what they found was a sort of simple algorithm which went like this. So you first detect duplicate tokens in the input. So in the case of Robert, Matthew, you had Robert, Matthew, Robert. Right? And Robert gave the ring to. Then you inhibit the tokens that are duplicated. You ignore those inhibit names, and you attend to the remaining name. And you move the remaining name to the output slot. So what's going to happen here is that what they call duplicate token heads are going to detect that Robert appears twice in the input. Then what they call inhibition and negative mover heads, they inhibit the duplicate token. Token mover heads then get the signal, well, these are not important, so we're not going to attend to these tokens in the input. We are actually going to attend to the remaining name in the input, namely Matthew, and copy that to the output slot. So that's going to be the next token that's going to be produced by the network. So then we will get an answer like this. Then Matthew and Robert had a lot of fun at school. Robert gave a ring to Matthew. Something similar, which is very interesting, was at play in the object color matching task. So blue pencil, black eraser, I don't remember anymore what the objects were. So, here they are. Yeah, good. So they found something similar. But here, interestingly, they found that GPT-2 Medium used a less than optimal algorithm that did not include inhibition step. It did not include that third or second step in the algorithm that was inhibiting the other relevant tokens. So they made a causal intervention in the network to make it do that. So they changed the algorithm that it was using, and then they got, then they got a jump in performance. to almost 94%. And what is the algorithm there that they posit? Here is sort of my reconstruction. It's not exactly how they put it. So the idea is that, again, the system detects duplicate tokens, finds the target of questions, so what is being asked about, right? I think the color of the pencil, if I recall correctly. Then you enhance the relevant token, so you make it something more important to attend to. You inhibit, and this is what they added, the other color tokens in the input. Then you attend to the color token that was, strongest after, these different attention operations, and move the stronger color token to the output slot. And here as well, they find specific attention heads doing specific parts of the job in the algorithm. So we have here, again, the duplicate token heads, then content gatherer heads, and then inhibition heads, inhibiting the other color tokens, or color names in this case. And then, the attending to the color that is has a highest value, and moving that to the output, and then copying it. And so producing the final output. So the answer is blue. The answer is blue. So what they say, here's a quote from the paper: both circuits involve the same general process, detecting a duplication and using that duplication to decide which token to copy. In the colored objects task, the duplication is used as a positive signal via the content gatherer heads to tell the mover heads which token to copy, while in the indirect object identification task, the duplication sends a negative signal via the inhibition heads to tell the mover heads which token to ignore, to copy the remaining. So this is here my sort of functional breakdown of what's going on in these cases. Right? So you have duplicate detection done by these functionally individuated attention heads, induction token heads or duplicate token heads. Then you have two options. Either they go directly to the inhibition heads that inhibit the duplicate, and then the mover heads copy the strongest token. Or, if the task requires it, you enhance actually the duplicate, inhibit the other tokens, optional, right, in the changed algorithm, and then the mover heads copy the strongest token of the move attending token. So a little bit like we have this, sort of structure when it comes to working memory, the idea is that we have a similar structure when it comes to these tasks and GPT-2 medium. One interesting thing to point out here is that Derulo and al., they here find a very similar algorithm that had been found by Wang and al. 2 years before on a 5 times smaller LLM, GPT-2 small, for what regards the indirect object identification task. So they found a very, very similar algorithm in 2 networks with quite different sizes, right, which is in itself a very interesting finding. And of course, they found the specific attention heads in GPT-2 medium that were doing each one of these things, right? That were doing the role of inhibition heads, duplicate heads, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that we have a similar structure, or can have a similar structure as we have in cognitive science, to try and bridge between, just looking at the nuts and bolts. Well, this head is doing that, this head is doing, attention head is doing that, and just looking at performance on the other side. Oh, the network is able to answer these questions correctly in the indirect object identification task. So maybe we also can have this sort of bridging structure, this functional bridging between performance and mechanistic implementation by means of an appeal to functional ontologies, so comprising functions themselves and functional structures. So here, I decided to label the function, the general function, as token selection and copy, or token choice and copy. So you have tokens in the input that are candidates for being the right answer or the right continuation, of the input. And what the function seems to be in both of these tasks is we have to find the right token in the input to copy as the answer, to output as the answer. But you may have, issues with that characterization. I mean, I have issues with that characterization. So one is, you can ask, well, is the LLM really solving those tasks? Or are we just being confused? Just because if humans are asked to do that task, then humans are doing indirect object identification and color matching. But maybe LLMs are not doing that when they solve this task. Maybe they're just like, yeah, let's just look at the duplicates and just copy or not copy them. And that's all there is to the task for, from the perspective, so to speak, of an LLM. Well, it's possible. It's unclear though. So we need so one option is that the task is not really testing for those capacities in LLMs, not really indirect object identification, not really object color matching. It's testing for something else, like, well, just find, duplicate the token, something like that. And this is the view that has been defended by a philosopher, Alex Grenzowski, on the basis of this older Wang study on GPT-2 small. But we also have another option. Well, maybe, the LLM is solving those tasks by means of doing this token choice plus copy function, right? Which is not, a non-trivial thing to do, right? Because identifying which token among the many tokens in the input is the relevant one is not easy, right? I mean, it's easy for us, it comes naturally, but, try to think, in more basic terms, it's not obvious. Right? So you have different, several different tokens in the input. How do you pick one, the right kind, the right candidate for being an answer, right? So, for example, in one case, it has to be a name, the name of a person. In the other case, it has to be a color of an object, right? So it has to have the right syntactic function and appropriate semantics. But we don't quite know how exactly those functional components, if that account is right, how they are able to pick the specific things, right? So that they identify, well, this is a name, this is a color, or this is a person's name, and things like that. But this seems to be involved in what the functional components are doing. So one thing that can help is try to look for similar functional structure in other tasks that may require this general, token choice plus copy function, but that are perhaps more complex, and see whether the systems are also using these algorithms to try and solve that. So this is another worry that's not so interesting. So you may think, well, didn't you just replace the tasks with a different one, this token copying one? Well, this is a thing that also appears when you talk about cognitive ontology in cognitive science. So it's important to keep in mind that the function helps explain performance. Right? So as much as, digit span tests, letter span tests, and reading span tests, they are different tasks supposed to probe how memory, working memory works. Right? So working memory cannot be reduced to complex span tasks, digit span tasks, and so on and so forth. They are just tests to allow us to investigate how working memory works. Another worry is that we are just redescribing what the LLM is doing. And the answer here is yes and no, right? In one sense, functional structures and functional explanations in general, they are redescriptions, but they are abstract descriptions of what's going on mechanistically in a system. But it's very important that, that they are abstract, because this means that the same functional structure can be realized by different specific mechanisms. Right? So different kinds of computations or arrangements of work between different, say, attention heads or different neural populations can lead to the same functional structure. So the relationship between functional structure and mechanism is one to many. So one functional structure can be realized by many different kinds of mechanistic implementations. So this gives us more generalization power. As you can say, well, yes, the mechanisms are different here, but the functional structure that they are implementing is the same across these different systems. So another worry is that the posited function, that token individuation or selection and copying is too narrow and specific. So one answer to this is that, well, these are very simple systems, right? 500 million parameters. So this is maybe what you should expect from such small systems. But you can also think, well, is it really that narrow, right? Because it seems like it's a rather generic and general function to find previously mentioned relevant information for the task at hand. And then you may have another worry finally. Well, but isn't that then just redescribing what next token prediction is, which is basically what the systems are supposed to be doing? And well, not quite, right? Because you can do next token prediction by different means. For example, if you need to find information somewhere else, not in the input, for example, but in your storage, so to speak. So the idea is that only for some tasks that structure, that hypothesis is going to work, right? So tasks that involve this sort of simple local, like in the nearby context of the network, can be solved by just looking at that context and finding the token that is the answer and copying it. So it's a quite specific kind of task for which this is going to be useful, while next token prediction can be achieved by many different means. All right, so we do get another worry though, final worry, if I recall correctly. So don't we have the similar problems regarding, generalization and toy models, since this is a study done on a small model? Well, yes and no, right? So it's true, the functional components and structure that I presented come from studies on these small LLMs. So the specific goings-on and the implementation may not be extendable to bigger LLMs, but functional components and structure may well be there, just differently realized. Right? And we got some reason to think this by this fact that the same functional structure was found in GPT-2 small, which was 5 times smaller than GPT-2 medium. So apparently, or we have reasons to believe that this may be a more general solution that LLMs find in general to solve these sorts of tasks. So in a way, we could think of small LLMs as sort of model systems, a little bit, but with emphasis on the little bit, like we use other sorts of biological systems to try and model some features of human cognition, like mice and corvids and stuff like that. All right, so I'm going to skip this because I think I already woefully out of time. But one, point that is worth stressing is that abstractness is very important here. That's what allows for more generalization. So this is the idea. And as much as we don't have any explanatory independence between these categories in cognitive science, we don't have here as well. Right? So different performance in benchmarks suggest or give us reasons to think that there may be differences in the functions that those systems are capable of carrying out. For example, we find that, or Merullo and all found that if you don't use inhibition heads, then the performance in this task is only around 50%, while if you do use them, then performance jumps to 94%. And implementation does constrain functional capacity. So one thing why GPT-2 medium by itself did not use the inhibition part of the algorithm in the color object matching task that Merullo and all speculate about is that maybe being so small, there was a bottleneck effect in the network, such that there was no time, so to speak, in inference time for the inhibition heads to add their contribution to the processing of the input, just because the network is not deep enough, it's not big enough for that. All right, so just to conclude, so I've talked about AI systems as research tools, a familiar notion, and as research objects, which is sort of newish, not quite. I mean, in the 80s, some connectionists were also doing that with very small systems. Then as research objects, I argue that understanding AI systems can be helped by appeal to what they call functional ontologies, in analogy to cognitive ontologies in cognitive science. Different ontologies may apply to different kinds of systems, but of course it's risky to rely on human categories or intuitions when deciding these ontologies, because they are very different systems than us, so we shouldn't assume that the way they solve tasks is similar to the way that humans or other biological systems solve tasks. So one way of seeing this project then is as, one way in which work on AI understandability can go on is by means of investigating the possible ontologies for intelligent systems over and beyond biological ones. And that's what I've called in a recent paper AI as exploration, or one aspect of AI as exploration. So AI not as something that helps us understand intelligence in biological systems, nor merely building useful tools, but also giving us tools to explore different ways in which intelligence can be realized, perhaps in ways very unlike the ways intelligence is realized in biological systems. I'll stop here. Thank you.